Yes, John McCain is an absolute disgrace to this nation. Right after his first round of chemo, he's now fanning the flames with a direct assault on President Trump. It's really time for John McCain to go back to Arizona and retire. Okay? It's time for that right now. I'm tired of reporting on this traitor to America continuing to bash our president simply because he's taken money from Soros. Okay? Now, Martin Walsh at the Conservative Tribune reports ahead of his highly anticipated return to Washington, D.C. next week, Senator John McCain candidly revealed how he thinks that President Trump has fared in office thus far. In an op-ed that was published this week in the Washington Compost of all newspapers, McCain said that Congress needs to restore order. Let me pause for a second. Just the fact that McCain is writing for the Washington Post should say it all. Okay, the Washington Post is the biggest enemy of conservatism, the biggest enemy of Trump. And McCain is working hand in hand with them to spew his hatred for the presidency. Now, in this op-ed, he said that Congress needs to restore order, partly because it's dealing with a president who is often poorly informed and impulsive. He said our system of government requires pragmatic problem-solving from even the most passionate partisans, he stated. They go on to write here that after admitting lawmakers should respect Trump's authority and constitutional responsibilities, McCain said Congress answers only to the American people, not the President of the United States. We're not his subordinates. We don't answer to him. We answer to the American people. Okay, that's all fine, and that's true. However, you also have your parties, Republicans, Democrats, okay? And with that, you have an allegiance to your party, right? Trump is, by default, the head of the Republican Party. And whether you like him or not, he is the one that's setting policy, setting agenda. So yes, of course, Congress works for the American people, but you also have your party affiliations and your party platforms that people vote you into office for. So therefore, you should be working with President Trump, because Trump is answering to the American people who voted for him. You see how that works, McCain? I got to give you this education all the way from Chicago. Maybe that chemo's getting to you. Maybe you really should just go retire, man. Just get out of it. Just get out. You know, I mean, selling arms to our enemies, really? Come on. The guy's a total whack job. Anyway, I'm tired of John McCain. He's a total traitor and needs to be voted out of office or just retire. So please, someone, rise up in his place. What are your thoughts? Comment below. Subscribe for updates. If you like what we're doing, give us a thumbs up and share this
with a few other cases. Sandy Rogers and Scotty Richardson from Aiken, South Carolina. You familiar with that case?
No, sir.
How about Roger Dale Rice from Lauren, South Carolina? You familiar with that case?
No, sir.
Eric Nicholson or Marcus Whitfield from Greenville, South Carolina. You familiar with that case?
No, sir.
Russ Sorrow from Greenville, South Carolina.
No, sir.
Or Kevin Carper from Spartanburg, South Carolina.
No, sir.
Professor, those are just a handful of the more than 340 police officers who were killed in the line of duty in South Carolina. And Kevin Carper's case is most instructive because his partner did CPR on the suspect that killed Kevin, trying to save his life. Let me ask it another way. Are you familiar with the case of Ricky Samuel?
No, sir.
How about Tamika Houston?
No, sir.
How about Nell Lindsay?
No, sir.
Miranda All?
No, sir.
Santiago Rios?
No, sir.
Those are all folks that were the victim of intra-racial homicides in South Carolina. And I hasten to add there were not protests either with any of those police officer killings or any of the intra-racial killings. And I suspect you agree with me, Professor, that all lives matter, whether you're killed by a police officer or your next-door neighbor. You're every bit as dead, aren't you?
Yes, sir. I actually, as a former prosecutor and someone who's worked with police officers, have the deepest respect for them.
So do I. And despite that deep respect, Professor, I still maintain the objectivity of prosecuting police officers who engaged in misconduct. We have a process in place if you don't think you can be fair. It's called recusal, which is what some of us did in every single one of our officer-involved shootings. We recused it to another prosecutor so he or she could make that decision. So there is a process in place. You called for a process. There is one. It's called recusal. Do you know, as a former prosecutor, or can you deign what may have been the biggest impediment to our being able to successfully prosecute homicide cases, particularly homicide cases involving victims of color, in my criminal justice jurisdiction? Do you know what the biggest impediment was?
In Massachusetts, one of the biggest impediments is trying to get witnesses to come forward.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. You have a victim of color, and we had trouble getting witnesses to cooperate with law enforcement and prosecutors, which then, as you know, diminishes the quality of that case and your ability to prosecute it, which may result in a lesser plea bargain because you don't have the facts, which may then result in what you said in your opening statement, which is people have a tendency to treat black lives differently than white, when the reality is the case wasn't quite as good. Isn't that a possibility too?
For every prosecutor who's out there, this is a serious problem, and you are correct in pointing that out, sir.
Right, and it wasn't just me pointing it out, Professor. I happen to have a fantastic chief of police when I was the DA. Fantastic man by the name of Tony Fisher, who happened to be an African-American chief of police. And he lamented the exact same thing you and I are talking about, is the loss of life in his community and the refusal of people to cooperate, even in a drive-by shooting of an 8-year-old at a birthday party. A drive-by shooting outdoors where the whole world saw the car drive by, and nobody would cooperate with the prosecution in the murder of an 8-year-old. So I hope that part of this 21st century police strategies conversation that we're having includes getting people to cooperate with law enforcement so you can hold people to the exact same standard regardless of the race of the victim. Because let me tell you what my goal is. My goal is for witnesses to feel comfortable cooperating. But here's my other goal, and I'm out of time, but I'm going to share it with you. I want us to get to the point where we lament the death, the murder of a black female like Nell Lindsay, just as much if it's at the hand of an abusive husband, which it was, as we would if it had been at the hand of a white cop. I'd like to get to the point where we're equally outraged at the loss of life, and I hope we can get there. No offense intended to any of the four of you, but you were not the witnesses I wanted to settle these facts with. I wanted to ask the Department of Justice, but they're not here, so this is going to be a challenge. So I'll see if I can work my way through it. South Carolina passed a voter ID law in 2011, May of 2011. And in 2011, 1/3 of South Carolina's congressional delegation was African American. I may be mistaken. I suspect that South Carolina's percentage of African American members of Congress may have been the highest in the country in 2011. And as we now know, 1 of 2 African American United States senators is from South Carolina, in the person of my friend Tim Scott. In addition, South Carolina's governor is of Indian descent. Further to same, South Carolina's voter ID law was similar, if not less restrictive, than those DOJ had pre-cleared in New Hampshire, Virginia, and Georgia. And moreover, South Carolina's plan was similar, if not less restrictive, to plans approved outside of DOJ pre-clearance in states like Tennessee, Kansas, Indiana, which incidentally was affirmed by the United States Supreme Court, Idaho, South Dakota, and Michigan. And just to be clear, South Carolina's voter ID law allowed for the casting of provisional ballots where the voter did not have one of the forms of accepted identification. Now, that's withstanding the fact that South Carolina's new voter ID law made it easier to obtain one of those forms of identification, allowed for the casting of provisional ballots. So, Professor, in your testimony, you had mentioned the significance of having career prosecutors to make these decisions. Did I understand your testimony correctly?
Yes, absolutely.
Would you be interested to know whether or not the leadership of the Department of Justice ignored the opinion of these career prosecutors whose opinion you value so highly?
What I would want to know.
I want to know whether or not I want you to answer my question before you answer the one you want to answer, okay? Answer my question, and it is this. Would you be interested in knowing whether or not leadership in the Department of Justice ignored the advice of career DOJ attorneys?
Of course, but ignoring and disagreeing are not the same thing. I don't know what happened in that case.
Exactly, and we don't either. You know why? Because they won't tell us. They have ignored Senator Graham's letter. So I'm asking you, will you join Senator Graham and me in asking the Department of Justice whether or not they ignored advice from career attorneys to pre-clear South Carolina's plan? Will you join us today?
No, I think the deliberative process within the department is incredibly important. You can't get candid.
Is that a yes? Will you join us today?
No, Congressman. If you can't get candid views from career staff, if they know.
Are you interested in whether or not those candid views were ignored?
As a citizen, I would be interested whether they're ignored, but ignored.
As a citizen, how about as a law professor?
Yeah.
Would you be interested in whether or not sound legal advice was ignored for political expediency? Would you be interested in that?
Sure, but I think the proof in the pudding in this case is precisely in the opinion of the district court, which I referred to.
Oh, I've read the opinion. And by the way, who won?
And by the way, it was
who won?
A decision, by the way.
South Carolina won.
By the way,
and here's the difference. I'm going to reclaim my time. Here's the difference. There was a 1.6% difference in African Americans who had acceptable photo IDs, and white South Carolinians. 1.6% difference. 20 years ago, when I was working on voting rights cases, that was considered de minimis. Now it costs South Carolina $3.5 million to defend that 1.6% difference. But it also means this, that my fellow South Carolinians who are African American are 1.6% less likely, less able to enter a federal courthouse because an ID is required there also. And they are 1.6% less likely to be able to board an aircraft because it also requires a photo ID. They're 1.6% less likely to enter the front door of this building because it also requires a voter ID. So my time is up. I would simply say this to the men and women who have dedicated their careers at the Department of Justice, to the apolitical, nonpartisan enforcement of the law. I'm sorry that we're having to have this hearing. And I'm also sorry to the state of South Carolina that it had to spend $3.5 million to have a district court, ultimately a 3-judge panel, ultimately agree with us. And I'm sorry for the Department of Justice that they put politics ahead of the law. And with that, I would recognize the gentleman.